much. And I love that you're saying my name correctly, actually. In the Western world, I go by Joana, but actually my name is Joana Lenkova. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be joining you, and I'm really excited to actually attend a lot of the sessions as well. So hopefully today it will be a productive and informative session. We're going to talk about strategy and why strategic foresight is important in the modern world strategy. So I'm going to start sharing my presentation now, and we can crack on. Right, so the topic of the presentation today is the living companies, Foresight-Fuelled strategy to tame the future, and how we can use Foresight-Fuelled strategy to actually tame the future. We're going to take a brief journey through history of strategy. Then we will talk about strategic foresight in the living companies, and how living companies, what are the key traits of living companies, in fact. Then I would like to tell you a little bit about my own foresight journey within the Walt Disney Company. And we will finish with a couple of examples of how foresight is used in different companies to fuel strategy so that these companies can become living companies. So let's crack on, shall we? I'm sure some of you know that actually the first strategists appeared during the Warring States period in China. So basically they were advisors, military advisors that were traveling within different states, advising the leaders on military tactics. And they were actually receiving payment for their services. Some of you would definitely know Sun Tzu and the Art of War, a book which we still quote when we talk about strategy. As much as I love this book, though, I think that modern strategy has to be different, and we should start to move away from thinking about strategy as a battlefield and how we can actually beat our competition, more into how we can collaborate so that all of our stakeholders actually benefit from the existence of a company. The modern strategy, or rather the business strategy, was introduced when BCG opened doors on July 1st, 1963. Since then, many of you would know and probably use the different tools like the SWOT analysis, Porter's 5 forces, the growth matrix, and as much as they were good tools at the time, the world has moved on, but we still have these tools to use. We say that we live in a VUCA world, which is a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And unfortunately, right now, I think we all feel that this is very true at the moment. So as the world has moved on, so should our strategy move on as well. Meanwhile, we have also seen that the average lifespan of a company is actually shrinking, where it was 60 years in the late 50s. Most recently, it was about 20 years. So we wonder why this is happening, and we often say, oh, it's because of technology and the fact that not many companies are going through technological transformation fast enough. But we see that there are many other factors that actually influence the lifespan of a company and the success of a company. And we have a couple of examples of companies, which we call the living companies, which have been around for many, many years. The first ever recorded company is Stora in Sweden, which was established over 700 years ago. Then we also have Japan's Sumitomo, established in 1590. So these companies, at least Stora, has gone through the Middle Ages, 2 world wars, the Industrial Revolution, and both of them looks like are surviving the technological revolution as well. So these living companies should have some similarities and some traits which potentially we can learn from. Shell is one of the famous companies that uses scenario planning in its strategy. And famously, they actually managed to avoid the oil crisis in the 70s because of their use of scenario planning in their strategy. So Arie de Geus, who was part of the scenario planning team within Shell, actually embarked on a journey to learn what are the key traits of these living companies that were older than Shell. And Shell at the time was 100 years old. So he found about 30 companies, and these are the key traits that he selected and he drew from his research. So the living company should have a clear awareness of its identity, meaning we should know what our company stands for, as well as what our company doesn't stand for. Some trade-offs are going to be necessary, and that's okay. We as a company should have sensitivity to the world around and a very high tolerance to new ideas. There was a fourth one, which I haven't included here because it's conservatism in finances, which is very valid. But these three I'm pointing out because they're also traits of strategic foresight. So what is strategic foresight and what is futures thinking? Foresight, in fact, is a methodology or framework that we use to identify not only different threats in the future, but also opportunities, and that's very important. We are also able to use different tools to evaluate what the impact of the macro driving forces is on our business, on our operating environment, on our industry. And it helps when we plan our strategy to actually select a better or the best course of action. It's not necessarily, it's not something that replaces strategic planning as we do it today, but it definitely complements it and it adds value because it sees things, it shines a light on things that we would otherwise miss as opportunities or as threats. So futurists, what futurists do is, and what's most commonly perceived that we do is that we identify trends, but that's only the start of it. So we look at different signals that could signify that certain trends are going to come out in different areas. And a good way to think about it is we have to look on a macro level outside of our industry. And if we use this model where I'm sure it's quite widely known, the PESTEL model, we're able to focus our energy into areas where we would not normally look. So for example, if we're a company that operates in the tech environment, we're more likely to focus on technology trends. However, all of these political, economic, social, environmental, legal, all of these will have impact on our industry in the long run. So it's important that we look on a macro level at a variety of different sources, at a variety of different areas of focus. So let's talk about strategy today and what strategy tomorrow should look like. So strategy today, the way that we plan and forecast is usually very linear. So we look at the past data of how our company has performed, and we basically extrapolate it into the future, usually fueled by financial prognosis and financial interests or the interest of our shareholders. What the strategy tomorrow should look like is we should consider the different macro forces and use scenario planning to actually envision different types of futures, of possible futures, because having just one official future is actually a sure way to not be right and not be correct, considering the very dynamic environment we live in. So I think a lot of times the business analysts that are actually helping in terms of gathering data should start to become more futurists. They should start to gain skills to be able to not only extrapolate data or work with hard data, but also to have additional skills in terms of spotting different trends, analyzing them and imagining what they may bring for the future and how they can impact the course of action and the course of the company that the company is on. Strategy is usually quite internally focused. And when I say internally focused, I mean it's focused on a particular industry. And we all know how we track different competitors. We try to be better than them. But disruption and innovation usually comes from cross-industry, either collaboration or it comes from a completely different industry in terms of sourcing ideas. So strategy tomorrow should actually be more externally focused, and it should source inspiration from other industries. That's one of my favorite ones, hierarchical. And I'm saying that obviously jokingly. I think hierarchy is important, but we really have to understand that the best ideas don't always come from the top. And especially when a company is looking to innovate, it's extremely important to have sensors throughout the entire organization. So there's a brilliant article that is called The Execution Trap, which if you're interested, you can read. But based on that article, it argues that strategy and execution should not be separated. Because what happens usually is strategy comes from the thinkers at the top, and execution is obviously rolled down the layers of the organization. So if something works well, we say, oh, it was a brilliant strategy. But if something fails and it doesn't work well, we say, well, actually the strategy was very well done, but the execution wasn't good. So what happens is all the people who are actually responsible for the execution, they don't feel engaged at the end because they're not incentivized enough to feel proud that they're part of the strategy. And he labels them, the author of the article labels them as choiceless doers. So instead of having this approach, he suggests that we should use cascades of choices at various levels. And we should treat execution as part of strategy as well. So if everyone has a specific remit in which they're taking different choices and responsibilities, everyone would be much more engaged. And we wouldn't, if something doesn't work out, we wouldn't blame the execution and only reward the people who thought of the strategy. It's all one common objective. A lot of times as well, I think we are very reactive. And I guess we can think about the current times as well. And I understand that this is a wild card and it was very difficult to predict. And it has a very big impact globally on everyone. But we should be more proactive in how we shape our own future as a company. Usually we tend to react to the external forces versus trying to see how they can develop and trying to already implement certain actions to mitigate the risks or to capture the opportunities. And a last concept here is the shareholder-driven strategy of today versus the stakeholder-driven strategy of tomorrow. And again, I would reference a topic that you may want to research further. It's called the economics of mutuality. And basically, it talks about longevity and how a company that wants to be a living company can not only satisfy all the stakeholders that includes the employees, which nowadays want to be a lot more engaged and purpose-driven, the consumers, which actually hold companies responsible for their actions a lot more nowadays than before. And also they look up to them to solve global issues, not just sell them a product. And if we look at the stakeholders as well as everyone who is a supplier and everyone throughout the value chain as well, how important it is to incentivize their development and their growth. And also think about the environment as a stakeholder. We have been talking a lot about climate change and the impact of different organizations on climate. We're forgetting a little bit about that now because we have a more pressing issue, which is connected to the pandemic, but this is not going to go away. It's still going to be impacting the way we live. So a company called Catalyst, in cooperation with Oxford University, is currently working on how this model can be developed. And in fact, it started in 2007 by the family-owned company Mars. And it's really interesting to read about that, and the case studies and the tests that they have done are actually showing that the more we think about our stakeholders in a responsible and sustainable way, the better the profits at the end are. So I really suggest you should read about that. I'm definitely very interested in the subject and researching it at the moment as well. So now I would like to share with you a little bit of my Disney foresight journey, and then give you a couple of examples of how strategic foresight worked at Disney, as well as at Rolls-Royce as a different company. So I joined Disney in 2015, and I joined as a strategist for Disneyland Paris, for several markets, among which the UK, and based here in London. So 1 month into the role, and with a strategy that was already set for the year, I started to encounter all sorts of different surprises. So first, it was the migrant crisis, which started to impact the ability of people and the desire of people to travel from the United Kingdom to France. Then we got the horrible terror attacks in November, which of course impacted travel and impacted the perception of safety. So again, the consumers were impacted and the business was impacted. We then started to talk about the EU referendum, which led to the pound value dropping and later on fluctuating, which means the purchasing power for the UK-based customers going into EU, Euro country was impacted as well. Then we got more terror attacks. So more reluctance to travel, more reluctance to, more insecurity to visit different countries. And then we got the leave vote in the United Kingdom, which I think is one of the things that nobody was prepared for. Nobody really believed that this is going to happen. And it shows that our wishful thinking sometimes can really blind us. And this is an extremely good example of why we should use scenario planning in cases like this, because the world doesn't work that way. Things don't happen the way we wish them to happen. So fortunately for me, a few months after I joined and before the leave vote in the UK happened, I was selected to participate in the strategic foresight team of Futurists of Walt Disney International. And I had learned about foresight, scenario planning in particular in the past, early in my career. So I already had the interest, but I was never professionally trained to be able to actually really implement it. So a company called Kedge, which consists of Frank and Yvette, who are both actually speaking in different panels today and tomorrow. So you can join their talks as well. They came to the United Kingdom and they trained us within Disney. And luckily for me, before the leave vote actually happened, I started to think about what the implications are going to be long-term on the consumers, on the business, on our strategy. And these skills that I learned started helping me every day in my role when I was thinking about strategizing and about the future. And then after the leave vote, it wasn't over. we started to get the long and tedious Brexit negotiations, which impacted all sorts of things, from the pound to the purchasing power to the consumer behavior, and overall the perception, the security perception, and the optimism for the future as well. So I had no idea what journey I was going on, but I'm surely glad that I actually started my foresight journey because I found a lot of benefit in how to handle uncertainty and how to be able to prepare to a certain extent for things that are outside of my control. So I mentioned the Walt Disney International Strategic Foresight team of Futurists, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. How the whole thing started. About maybe 10 years ago, the chairman at the time of Walt Disney International spoke with the head of HR, and they started a project called Workforce of the Future. And the idea there was, okay, so we are seeing all these things shifting and changing, and there's this automation that's coming. So what are the sort of skills that our talent pool should have in the future? And Kedge, the same company that trained me, they in fact were engaged to work on that project. And what began as a Workforce of the Future project very soon turned into an organization-wide foresight competence in development. And that meant that there were many different people at many different levels in many different countries that were trained to use the strategic foresight methodology. And that led to over 500 people trained across 15 teams and 10 geographic regions. So I'm mentioning this because that's quite different than a one-off exercise and a one-off scenario planning workshop, which I'll talk about in a bit. It's really a cultural change, and it's really changing the way the whole organization thinks. And it very much resonates with me and with the article that I mentioned earlier about strategy, execution, and the different levels of hierarchy within the company. One of the things that I'd like to mention here is that the selection criteria and the way that the teams worked were very liberal in terms of hierarchy. And one of the most important things was to have diversity of thought. And the teams consisted of people who were from different levels within the organization, from different skills, background, different cultures even. And this really expands the thinking. It creates an environment of sharing and sometimes even opposing views, which are in fact very beneficial in strategic foresight, because we often want to live in a perceived security and have something that's official and have something that's data-based. But the future is not as certain. And yes, we can impact it, and we should work to create a better future. But it also takes imagination, and it takes really thinking outrageously about the future. No one would have thought that we're going to be in a lockdown at the moment if they were using the information from last year or even from 2 months ago. So it's really important to have diversity of thought and to implement not only data-based decisions, but also create opportunities for scenarios that are also based on the trends and based on creativity of thought. And the last example that I would like to share with you is how scenario planning happened at Rolls-Royce. So for those of you who don't know, I'm not talking about the car division that was sold to BMW a few years ago. I'm talking about Rolls-Royce that currently operates in, they create airline engines. They also have marine operations, as well as civil nuclear operations as well. So 2014 for them was actually the year of the perfect storm. There was a decline in wide body airline orders. the Chinese economy growth rate slowed down. That was the end of the commodities boom. The oil price declined, and the Fukushima disaster happened. I mean, it's definitely the definition of the perfect storm. So in 2016, the Rolls-Royce leadership participated in a scenario planning workshop because they had a new CEO in 2015 who tried to save the company, basically. Their shares fell 50% after what happened in 2014, and there were talks about selling off parts of the company. So he initiated this initiative, and their leadership participated in that workshop, trying to imagine what the future is going to look like in 2040. So as you can see, this is a very different approach to what the Walt Disney Company did at the time, but it's still extremely important to have this exercise. And even though the way that strategy was done didn't change dramatically, it's still, when financial decisions are taken, the company still uses these scenarios or an update of these scenarios to actually sense check the strategy. So again, extremely different way, but extremely useful for the entire company and the decisions that they're taking, considering that it is a living company. It's been here for a while, and it intends to stay here for a while. So these are the two examples that I wanted to share with you. Hopefully you have found this informative. And now we can go into Q&A. So, okay, the first question. It has been said that Africa's window of opportunity is approaching. However, we have a skills mismatch, a surplus of unnecessary skills and a scarcity of necessary skills. How do we determine what the workforce of the future needs to be prepared for? This is, Marguerite, it's an extremely interesting question. I think it would take more time to consider and to elaborate on it, but I think you would probably have to go through the entire exercise of, first, are we looking at a 10-year basis or 20 years? And consider what the world is going to look like in 10 years. And it's not going to be just one answer. You're going to have a scope of different opportunities that in different scenarios that you need to work out. I think another important thing here is that, and that's from my innovation background, I suppose, sometimes certain innovation happens slower, so it's kind of incremental innovation. And sometimes in areas that have not necessarily progressed step by step, they do the innovation leap, which I think is a great opportunity for countries everywhere, really. So I would say go through the scenario planning. If you're not able to, if you don't know how to do it, then find a consultant or a company or someone with the skill set to actually help you and guide you through it. And I would really advise that you monitor them closely so you can get these skills as well. And then create a list of necessary skills, as you call them, that will work in most of the scenarios. I think we're not ever going to be able to predict with 100% security and correctness what is going to be the future, but we will be at least prepared to a certain extent with the necessary skills for the future. Thank you for this one. We have another question. Which tools do you use for the scenario planning workshop? I personally use a methodology called the Natural Foresight methodology by the Futures School. There are many different methodologies which you can use. There are a few tools which I really like. I can mention some of them, but you kind of have to go through the whole process. So one of my favorite tools is the probability impact matrix. And in fact, I'm going to show you because I have it. So I'm just going to share my screen. Because we talk a lot about trends, and most people have access to different reports on different trends. And for us futurists, trends is, I suppose it's not enough. It's the start, as I mentioned earlier. But if you're not necessarily trained in the field, or if you don't have a consultant at hand, what you can do in your own time as part of your strategy planning, you can gather the different trends that you have seen in a report, let's say, and then you can plot them onto this impact and probability matrix. So if anything, if any of the trends are actually medium to high impact and high probability, then these for sure should be included in your forecast. The rest, I would suggest that you do it together with someone who is trained in the methodology. But that's at least a start. We have another question. We have many questions. Let me select one. A question by Amit. When do you recommend triggering a revision of scenarios within corporate context? Is it driven by external events or management changes, or needs to be done as a regular process? And if so, how frequently? I think that, again, an amazing question. I think that there are different ways in which you can fuel your strategy with the futures thinking. So scenarios can be done. It can be a very long process to create very thorough scenarios, and it can take 6-9 months sometimes. So if you go for the very thorough process, then you don't need to update the entire work that often. Maybe you can do it once a year. But I think my advice would be to keep listening to the signals that are happening around us and to the environment, and iterate and update the small things within the scenarios, keeping the organization informed of the small things, and really trying to train a lot of the people within the organization to think in that direction, to think like futurists, to consider the factors that are happening outside of your immediate environment. So I think that's for me the right answer. How does a company go about imagining a future so far out, say like your 2040 example? Since change seems to be growing exponentially, how do they figure out what things will be like in 20 years? Well, it's a great process, actually. It's quite an engaging process to do that. There are different tools. There's a methodology that you need to follow, and a lot of times it's really fiction. And again, the point is not to be precise. The point is to stretch your thinking and to really think outrageously, so that you can have a very wide scope of possibilities. We don't want to predict the future. We want to really stretch our mind and imagine the impossible, so that when we do our strategy, it kind of checks out in many different scenarios, not just one, the official one. Hopefully that answers the question somehow. Ali, how can companies consider scenarios they cannot envision today? Who would have thought we would be in a global pandemic today? How do we unchain our imagination? I think I answered somewhat the question with the previous answer, but I think it's quite difficult to enter this mindset, because we're very used to, in our nature, it is kind of programmed to look for certainty. And I think sometimes we mistakenly think that we have this certainty, where in fact, we're just comforting ourselves with one possible scenario. And that's even more dangerous than imagining the unimaginable. So for me, there are different ways in which you can think and brainstorm and create scenarios. What's important is the diversity of thought, because we are set, we come with our own cultural backgrounds, with our own beliefs. And one thing that I was taught when I was trained is to look beyond our own biases and our own confirmation bias, because it's apparent even in the way that we look for information. We try and scan and select the information that actually suits our beliefs. And that's why we need other people. And it shouldn't be a lonely exercise. You should have as much diversity of thought and really discussions with people from opposing views to be able to create a more colorful picture, I think. Thanks for this question, Ali. Okay, Jay, for companies stuck in the here and now, how would you advise an organization's executive team on some initial steps they can take to see more, see differently, and think differently about the future? That is a great question, again, and a question that I think most organizations are actually struggling with. So there is the notion of exploit and explore and ambidexterity in organizations, meaning we tend to be focused on what works now and kind of try to put all of our energy into doing more of the same. But that does not help us be a living company, because the world is changing so rapidly. It may have worked in the past, it doesn't work anymore. And I think the leadership team, the executive team, should really engage the entire organization, because there is the diversity of thought, and start dedicating some time to thinking about the future and to exploring for innovation in terms of products, in terms of business model. And I think right now is actually probably a very good time to innovate and to experiment, because usually we're very risk adverse. But right now, and we were talking about this yesterday at a different webinar, but right now I think we feel like we don't have so much to lose, because we have to find ways to make things better. So I think we're more able to take risks now and free to take risks. Thank you, Jay. How do you make sure that a given signal is reliable? Some say one should look into scientific journals, but this seems to be unrealistic. Thomas. Yeah, so of course, there are a lot of fake news and people's opinions, and I suppose that's the danger of having access to so much information and being able to post yourself so much information. What I think is that we should obviously look at reliable resources, but it's also really interesting how your brain starts to get trained to pick up certain things. So when you do your scanning, meaning reading all sorts of different articles in the categories that I showed before, you start to pick up different signals earlier than obviously they show up as trends. And it's really about rewiring the connections within your brain, and it only happens when you do this repetitively and constantly. How to pick up something that is not going to become a trend? Well, I suppose there is always a risk that something may die out, and the future is uncertain. We are not sure 100%, but you can start thinking and analyzing what is actually driving this trend. And that is going to help you, in fact, to see what are the changes within society that are provoking for this trend to be happening. And maybe along the way, you will pick up other trends actually, and other implications of this. Thank you, Thomas. Marta, how would you advise to push foresight in a corporate context that understand the need but has difficulty to commit to dedicating specific resources to this kind of work? Again, it's quite an interesting one. I think different organizations do it in a different way. With foresight, it's quite difficult to show something very tangible immediately, because we're talking about the future. But there are different ways in which you can show the benefits of foresight. So, for example, just looking at the different trends and their implications on a company during a strategic planning session, for example, could be a good way of proving the benefit from having that macro view. So I would say that's one way of doing that. Okay, well, thank you very much for the amazing questions. I'm going to be very happy to learn more, to hear your experiences. So feel free to contact me. I guess the best way is on LinkedIn. Thank you very much, Fran, for organizing this. It was a pleasure.